Hi everyone, so we're going to look at attribution theory in this session. As we know, attribution theory forms part of sports psychology. It is one of the main topics that we need to focus on. So within this, we're going to be looking at Weiner's model, okay, and all the components of that. And then we're going to look at learned helplessness and mastery orientation. Now, what I want you to do is, if you're using this as a revision session, I want you to have a go at this recap task to start with. So I want you to pause your video, and what I'd like you to do is to start off by defining attribution. Okay, if it was part of a short 2-mark question, could you give a definition of it? Okay, can you then draw out Weiner's model? Do you know what it looks like? Okay, you can do that on the whiteboard, you can do it on a piece of paper, anything that you've got to hand. And once you've drawn it out, I want you to make sure that you've labelled it fully with all the different components. Okay, and then once you've done that, I want you to try and identify which attributions are controllable or uncontrollable. If you finish that quite quickly and you think, yeah, this is super easy, then have a little go at that extension activity. So if you could pause now for me, have a go at that. No more than 5 minutes, off you go. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to do that and you pause the video. So what is attribution theory? So essentially it's reasons that either athletes, teams, coaches, the reasons they give for success or failure. Now, we might be in the same sporting situation. I might be the athlete, my coach might be with me, and we might attribute different reasons for a success. So for example, I might attribute the success towards my ability. I might say it was because you know, I'm particularly talented, okay, for certain reasons. My coach might attribute my success towards my effort because they might say that I train hard. So it can vary from person to person, okay? But essentially it's what we interpret or perceive as being success, or the reasons for success or failure. Now, in Weiner's model, hopefully you've sketched it out very similar to this. And what I'm going to go through with you now is highlighting to you some of the phrases they might use in exam questions to do with this theory. So first of all, okay, here are our different types of attribution. So if we get an exam question, okay, that is focusing on types, we are talking about internal, external, unstable, or stable. Okay, there are our types of attribution. Then we've got our dimensions. So we've got here our locus of causality, and here we've got our stability dimension. However, there is also a third dimension that we can't visually see, okay, that was added later to the model, okay, and that is the locus of controllability, okay, so whether something is within our control or if it's uncontrollable, so if it's outside of our control. And then after our dimensions, we have our examples, okay, so if we're asked to give a sporting example, we'll try and tailor our examples around these key points here. Okay, so ability, effort, task difficulty, and luck. So when we're looking at the question, we're trying to interpret the question, we're looking for, are they asking us about the types of attribution? In which case we focus on these 4 components here. Are they asking us about the dimensions? So they can zoom in on any of the 3 dimensions. So if it's dimensions, we've either got locus of causality, we've got stability, or the third one, which isn't shown on here, controllability, okay, or locus of control. And then finally, your examples, okay, which are your ability, task difficulty, effort, and luck. So it's really important that we know the distinct difference between those so that we can correctly respond to a question. Now, that third dimension that I mentioned has been examined a few times, and they've asked for it in slightly different ways. So in the first time it was examined, they asked you to explain locus of control. Now, quite a few students, when asked to do this, they went and they explained locus of causality because they remembered it from the model. And they didn't kind of put the 2 together, they just saw the C. Okay, but when we're talking about locus of control, we're talking about, is it controllable or is it uncontrollable? Okay, so we can make the point that it's the third dimension and normally get a mark for it if we're having to explain it. We can normally make the point that it was added later than the other dimensions. So it was a bit of an afterthought, or something that they realised later was actually quite important. Okay, and you can see here from the mark scheme, that's what it goes on to explain. Okay, it considers whether the outcome that we're attributing towards, is it under the performer's control or is it outside of their control? Okay, can they do anything to change it? Another way that they've asked is for sporting examples, which again is really, really typical of paper 2 questions. So we know here it's a give. It's very similar to like an identify command word, isn't it? So give 2 sporting examples of attributions that would be classed as uncontrollable. Okay, so the performer, it's outside of their control. So we've got here an example of controllable attribution here, because effort is something that we can control. However, any of the following we could argue are uncontrollable. Okay, things like the snow conditions, the performer couldn't do anything about that. Okay, the pothole, again, the performer couldn't do anything about that. So these are all more uncontrollable attributions, okay, where, you know, the performer has nothing that they can do to resolve it or change it, at least during the competition or the activity that they're participating in. So now we know what the dimensions are, now we know the model, we need to make sure that we can actually interpret certain statements or certain attributions that are given. So we've got a couple of statements here, and I want you just to have a little think about, right, what are these attributions saying? And normally, if we're given a statement, whether it's a statement like this, which is just taken from the press, or if we're given a statement from in an exam question, then we need to be able to try and interpret it. And the first thing that I do, and this is one of the tips that I've given here, is always try and start with the examples, you know, the 4 things in the middle of the model, because sometimes it's easier to actually work backwards. So for me, this first statement, we did everything we could to win and had courage with and without the ball. So to me, that's attributing towards effort. Okay, so this coach is attributed towards effort, and we know effort is an internal and an unstable attribution. So we've got here our type of attribution, we've got here the example, haven't we? Now, this one is a little bit harder, okay? Today it was clear we made mistakes and we were, and it should say not, it's a typo on my behalf, not clinical enough. Okay, so we made mistakes, so it's accepting responsibility for what they've done. We were not clinical enough. Is that down to their ability? Because they were making mistakes, they weren't good enough? So we could argue perhaps, right, well, if for the example, if we're saying it is ability, we think the coach is basically saying we were not good enough, perhaps it's down to their ability, or it could be down to the task difficulty, okay? So if we're saying it's down to ability, we know that's internal and stable, okay? Or we could interpret that slightly differently. We could say, actually, are they talking about task difficulty? And if they're talking about task difficulty, we know the type of attribution is actually external and stable. Okay, so on both aspects, we're saying this is quite a stable attribution. Now, this links into, okay, a critical evaluation point for this model, because actually Reiner's model, when it was made, it wasn't made for sport. Okay, it's been adjusted and adapted to try and suit sporting situations, but it doesn't always work. So particularly if you're doing a 10-mark question, it's super helpful to have this kind of in your bag as a critical evaluation point, the fact that it's not necessarily sport specific. So when we come to looking at statements like this, sometimes it can be a bit difficult to try and apply it to sports situations, particularly team games where the task difficulty is going to vary depending upon either the competition that they're playing in or the team obviously that they're playing. So there's a few questions there that you should always try and think about, and I'll get rid of this so you can have a look at them. There's a few questions there you should always try and think about if you are looking at a statement. Okay, so types and examples. Can you pick out the types and examples? Can you say whether they were effective or ineffective in motivating the performer? Okay, because essentially that's what attributions do. They either motivate or demotivate us. Okay, would they lend themselves to mastery orientation, or learned helplessness. Again, two key terms we're going to remind ourselves of in a moment. And could you suggest alternative attributions? So if you're a coach, or if you're perhaps mentoring that coach, could you suggest ways that they might attribute differently? So with this one here, if that coach was attributing towards the player's ability, what issues might that cause? Okay, would that cause them to have you know, a lack of confidence? Because actually, if you're attributing towards ability, which is stable and internal, that performer or that group of performers can't control that. So if it's uncontrollable, then they can't change it, and therefore they might feel this feeling of learned helplessness where, well, if we play that team again, or if we're in that situation again, we're never going to be able to succeed. Or if their coach could perhaps attribute differently towards something like effort, which is controllable, okay, and can be changed, then perhaps the players might go into the match again next time thinking, all right, we lost before, but it was because we didn't try hard enough. But this time we've worked a lot harder on our tactics, we've worked on our set pieces, we've put in a lot more effort, so actually we can make a difference this time. If it's ability, we can't change that. Okay, so it's always something to bear in mind. And these are the key terms. So hopefully you know these key terms. Okay, and we'll look at a question shortly to do with these key terms. So mastery orientation, that belief that you can be successful, you're in control, and they demonstrate what we call approach behaviours. Okay, taking risks, putting yourself forward for things. Learned helplessness, the opposite, feeling that failure is inevitable. Okay, we've got no chance, never going to happen. Okay, and performers experiencing learned helplessness demonstrate what we call avoidance behaviours. Okay, they don't put themselves forward. Okay, they've got that fear. And it's what we call global or specific. So there's different types of learned helplessness. So global learned helplessness is if you feel that way across all situations. Okay, however, specific learned helplessness might just be if you've had a negative past experience, perhaps with that competition. So you got to that semi-final before and lost, and do you feel like that's going to happen again? Or it might be a specific team that you experienced that with. So it's important, okay, that if we modify the way the performer or even the coach attributes success or failure, we can develop this feeling of mastery orientation and eliminate or even reduce those feelings of learned helplessness. And this final key term here that we've got in the middle, self-serving bias, this is what we tend to do to protect our self-esteem, or what our coaches might do to protect our self-esteem. So we might attribute failure to external reasons. So we might say, oh, you were just unlucky, that referee was really biased, he made a massive mistake there, it wasn't your fault. Okay, or it could be attributing to kind of the weather or something like that, but it's to try and protect the person's self-esteem, which can be quite good in the short term, but not necessarily as useful if it's in the long term. So I'm not going to spend too long on this, but this is just trying to get you to think about ability level and attributions. So if you've got a high achiever, very successful, they're more likely to be demonstrating mastery orientation. So they're going to attribute their successes internally to ability, which is going to increase their confidence, increase their motivation, and they're going to attribute their failures to internal unstable factors like effort, okay, because then it's controllable. If they need to, or they go into that situation again, they know they can make a difference. If we've got low achievers, they're much more likely to be prone to experiencing learned helplessness. So they're more likely to attribute their successes to external factors, like it was luck. You know, I was just lucky I scored that penalty because the goalkeeper went the wrong way. Okay, it was a really bad penalty, but I was just lucky. And they might attribute failure to internal factors, like I just wasn't good enough, okay, to their ability. And again, that reduces self-confidence, leading to feelings of learned helplessness. And then this one, we've turned to attribution retraining, but actually you could be asked about it, not in reference to attribution retraining, where we try and change individuals' attributions, but we could just be asked with regards to if a coach or a performer's attributions are good or not. So if we look, first of all, at a success, so it might be like you've won a competition. So that win, if you attribute it internally, okay, so if you attribute it towards your ability, if you attribute it towards your effort, for example, that's going to give you confidence, that's going to give you self-esteem. If you attribute that success to things like luck, like external attributions, or task difficulty, or they were just an easy team, then you don't normally have those feelings of pride, and actually it doesn't make you feel any better about that performance or make you feel like you had anything to do with it. Okay, so that's not necessarily a good way to attribute a success. Same with failure. So if, for example, if we've got a coach and the team has failed, okay, they might give external attributions to try and protect their self-esteem, okay, which is what we term with that self-serving bias. So they might attribute that failure to poor officiating. They might attribute that failure to we were just unlucky. Yeah, it didn't work out for us today, but it was just luck. That's great. Okay, protects the performer's self-esteem, eliminates shame, makes us feel a little bit better about ourselves. But there's a but. Okay, but that can hide the real reasons for failure. So again, this is like our AO3, isn't it? This is like our critiquing of this information. And then we've got failure. And if we attribute internally towards failure, it can reduce confidence, it can decrease motivation. However, okay, that's if we attribute internally to areas like ability. Actually, if we attribute internally to effort, this could be actually ideal, okay? Because if we attribute towards effort, we know that is, and it comes back to that third dimension, it's under our control, okay? So it's controllable. So we know if we do attribute failure towards effort, and we're a coach and we're saying to our performers, do you know what? We didn't win. However, if we work harder, like I said before with the other example, if we work harder next time, if we do this, this, and this, then we could win, okay? And we've got the chance to. So let's look at a couple of questions then just before we finish. It's really important that now you've had a review of the topic, you've revised it, do blurting, okay? Really good active revision technique. White blank piece of paper, no notes, nothing. What do you know on attribution? Blurt it down, okay? See what you remember. Once you've blurted, look at your notes, different colour pen. Right, completely forgot about that. I didn't include this. Okay, that's not right. Then once you've blurted, you've added practice questions. Do these questions. Again, no notes, attempt the questions, answer them as you would in the exam, times conditions if you can. Once you've done that, check the mark schemes, self-mark again, add to your blur. Is there anything on there that's on the mark scheme perhaps that you haven't got, which you think would be a really useful point? Okay, practice, practice, practice as many questions as you can. And when you got to the point where you practice as many questions as you can, create your own questions. Okay, what could be examined? Put yourself in the examiner's shoes. So there's a few questions here I'm going to go through. I'm not going to explain all the mark schemes with you. I'm just going to give you a chance to pause the video, look at the questions, have a go, move on, okay? And there's a couple that I'll stop at just to explain a few points. So the first one, so if you pause the video now. Okay, and hopefully you've had a go at that. So you can see here with the mark scheme, and we know the first introductory line is just telling us or introducing the area for us. The second line here is giving us our commands. So it wants practical examples and it wants an explanation. And we've got to do both in order to get the marks. And then here, strategies that a coach could use to promote mastery orientation. Okay. Next question, AO1, AO2. Okay, so quite a straightforward question, 4 marks. Pause the video, have a go for me. Okay, so hopefully when you looked at this question again, we read the introductory line, we know the topic's attributions. This time the attribution is given by the coaches, and it's identify, again, our command word, 4 different, and now we know, don't we, types of attribution given by the model. So 1, 2, 3, 4 types. And again, typical of paper 2, give a practical example of each type identified. So we know for this question, we need our types, we need our EGs. Okay, and I'll pop the mark scheme up for you, and you can pause the video, have a look at the mark scheme, and self-mark your answer. Okay, next question here. I'm going to put the mark scheme straight up for this one for you to look at. So this is a typical example of one of those statement questions. So you can see the statement here. It's a discuss question for the first part, and then the second part is a describe. So we've got discuss and describe as our key command words. And then we've got here what we call our and other information. So this is what we need to apply it to. So we need to apply what we're saying, okay, as to how it will motivate the cyclist. And if it's asking about discussing the effectiveness, essentially we want the pros and cons, the positives and negatives. So you've got the example here, linking to obviously that first part of the question, the discuss. And then here we've got our describe, the other attributions that a coach might use to motivate. So again, we've got that and other information. So we need to always link, right, if you're saying we're going to use or reattribute differently, why is that going to motivate the performer? Okay, why is that going to help? Okay, and then lastly, if we have a little look here, below are some of the reasons which a sports coach gave after their teams lost. Okay, so again, it's coaches attributing for their teams. This is an old question, but it's still really useful to use because it's still relevant to the new spec, and it will get you to practice applying your knowledge of attributional theory. So here we've got 4 statements. Okay, and it's asking us using this model. Okay, describe the different types of attribution again. So we all know what types are now, given by the coaches. Wants us to describe them. Okay, so for the first one here, like what I said before, I always try and work backwards. So for the first one, I'd be going, right, okay, annotating this. So this is down to task difficulty. Okay, task difficulty is external, stable attribution. Is it controllable? No, it's uncontrollable as well. Okay, so we've kind of identified the example, we've identified the types. Okay, and then we describe it. So we'd include this information, and then we'd start to talk about, right, you know, was it a good attribution? Was it not so good? So we might talk about the fact that, well, attributing failure to external factors outside the performer's control might be good for that, you know, initiating that self-serving bias, that protecting the performer's self-esteem. However, the issues might come with the fact that next time they play on a pitch that's quite slippery or that situation, they're going to immediately think, well, there's nothing we can do about it. So they might not try very hard. Whereas if the coach perhaps had attributed differently towards something like effort, okay, we lost this time, but next time, if we'd done this, if we'd changed our style of play, if we'd started to do shorter passes, we might have actually been able to win that game. So by reattributing, it might change the motivation of the performers to be in that situation again and to do better in that situation. So those are the kind of things that you would be discussing. So pause the video, have a go at that question. That was an old extended question, but if you think about that question perhaps as maybe a 6-mark question for the benefit of this or the purpose of this, pause the video, off you go. Okay, so here, if you want to pause, you can have a look at some examples that we might use for that first statement here. And then there's a mark scheme. Again, if you want to pause, self-mark your answer. And then lastly, this is a made-up 10-mark question. Okay, it doesn't exist, but it's just to show you how they could question you. So this 10-mark question isn't actually to do with Weiner's model, but it's asking us to apply attributional theory, so you could mention it, and practical examples. explaining how learned helplessness experienced by a performer can be modified into mastery orientation. So how can we get someone who feels like failure is inevitable, okay, to move to mastery orientation where they feel like success is possible and achievable? Okay, so we are going to talk within there about things like attribution or retraining, but we can also draw on other aspects of our specification which are relevant. So things like goal setting, super relevant. Yeah, positive reinforcement, all these different things that we can embed within this. Second part of the question, nothing to do with the topic we've just looked at of attribution, but this is what they do, don't they, on 10-mark questions. They tend to draw from two different parts of the spec. So here we've got analyse, the effectiveness. So we know if we normally see the words effectiveness, analyse, we normally talk about positive and negatives. Okay, and it's asking the pros and cons of a coach using extrinsic motivation to encourage the athlete to achieve success. Okay, so what are the pros and cons of a coach using that? Okay, so last thing for you to do, just check your knowledge of this topic area. Can you explain or describe Weiner's model of attribution? Okay, the types, the dimensions, the examples. Can you describe the stability dimension? Can you do the same with locus of causality? And can you do the same with the controllability dimension? Okay, are you confident enough to explain each of those? Can you explain what learned helplessness is? Okay, what it is, how players or performers might experience it, practical examples, and then reasons why it might be a barrier. Okay, because it directly impacts motivation, doesn't it? Okay, it might cause people to withdraw from taking part in sport. And then the last one, can you define and explain mastery orientation? Okay, why is that beneficial for sports performers to have mastery orientation and have those feelings that actually I can achieve and I can do well and I'm in control of my performance? Okay, that's it for today's session. I'll see you soon.